בחייה בציין ומספד בירושלים.
Hi everybody and welcome to a special edition for World Mizrahi of One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. As we all know, Professor Dershowitz is a leading expert in criminal and constitutional law and one of the leading experts in the world on anti-Semitism and on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Today, as befitting with Tisha B'Av, a date on everyone's calendar, which emphasized sinat chinam and hatred of Judaism, a day where we've had many great tragedies befall the Jewish people. We thought it particularly appropriate to have Professor Dershowitz talk to a little bit about this subject. So, Professor Dershowitz, thank you very much. By the way, one thing which is not related to this at all, but perhaps to the second half of Tisha B'Av, where the Mashiach is supposedly supposed to be born, is I'm actually recording this from Israel, but on Tisha B'Av itself, I'm actually going to be in Washington, D.C., where Motzei Tisha B'Av, the Israeli ambassador, is going to throw out the first ball for Team Israel, which is our national Olympic team, which is doing a tune-up, and they're doing a game in Bethesda, Maryland, prior to flying to the Olympics in Tokyo. So hopefully there'll be something optimistic as we finish Tisha B'Av. But let's get back to our program. Professor Dershowitz, speaking of anti-Semitism, can you give us your take on the recent spate of anti-Semitism, which we've seen around the world and particularly in the United States?
Well, there's nothing new under the sun, as Ecclesiastes says. Anti-Semitism goes back, obviously, to the Bible, to the holidays of Purim, and to the Exodus from Egypt. It's been with us since the beginning of time. But we had a moratorium between the end of the Shoah, between 1945 and I would say the beginning of the 21st century. We really had a moratorium on anti-Semitism. Jews were living in a golden age. There was some, obviously. Remaining anti-Semitism, the hard right has always had elements of anti-Semitism, as has the hard left. People don't really understand how the hard left has been anti-Semitic, but all you have to do is read the history of the Soviet Union and Stalin, and you'll see anti-Semitism on the hard left. Anti-Semitism has grown out of even liberalism. Voltaire was an anti-Semite. There are many others who have been anti-Semites over time. Jews have been anti-Semites. Gertrude Stein was an anti-Semite. I think you can find elements of anti-Semitism in Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein and others. So we've had it with us for a long time, but it's getting much worse. And it grows. The excuse for anti-Semitism today is Israel and the Israel-Palestine conflict, but that gets it backwards. The reason so many people support Palestine in the Israeli conflict is clearly anti-Semitism. If the Palestinians were allegedly being oppressed by some other country, as the Kurds are being oppressed by Syria and Iraq and Turkey, there'd be no sympathy for them. The Palestinian cause itself is not a cause for great sympathy. Palestinians turned down their own state in 1937-38 during the Peel Commission, 1947-48 when Israel was established after the United Nations divided the mandate. Palestinians could have had a state many, many, many times over, most recently when Ehud Olmert offered them virtually everything they wanted, but they did not respond in a timely fashion. And so the Palestinian case or cause for sympathy is far, far, far less compelling than the Kurdish case or the Tibetan case or many, many other cases around the world. But the only reason that there are demonstrations on behalf of the Palestinian cause all over the world is because the alleged oppressors are the nation state of the Jewish people. I don't think there's any doubt about that. As my friend Natan Sharansky has put it, and he was really echoing Tom Friedman, who has been a frequent critic of Israel, that, to criticize Israel for its policies is perfectly fine, and to call that anti-Semitic is wrong. If criticizing Israel for its policies were anti-Semitic, the greatest concentration of anti-Semites would be in Tel Aviv, and the greatest anti-Semitic newspapers would be in Israel, like Haaretz. That's not right. But to single out Israel for condemnation all out of proportion to other nations and to what it's done is clearly anti-Semitic, and Tom Friedman says that, and Anton Szymanski says that, and I've said that, and others have said that. And so a major source of anti-Semitism today is the Israel-Palestine conflict, but they have it backwards. It's the Israel-Palestine conflict and the fact that so many support Palestine and criticize Israel unjustly that is caused by anti-Semitism. And so we see it. I'll give you a recent example of how absurd things can get. There's a Society of Children's Book Writers. It's 22,000 members. It's very prominent, has lots of prominent children's writers around the world. And it recently, for the fourth time this year, condemned anti-Semitism because there's been so much of it, and it warranted condemnation. They immediately were condemned for condemning anti-Semitism by Palestinians who said you can't condemn anti-Semitism without also condemning what Israel does and what's happening to the Palestinians. And the society immediately apologized for condemning anti-Semitism and fired its diversity director and said that it would change its policies and never do it again. And it said it understood how Palestinians were fearful and afraid and scared by the condemnation of anti-Semitism. So today in the world we live in, you can't even condemn anti-Semitism without being condemned for doing it. And so I think we're living in a dangerous time. I think we're seeing for the first time really since the end of the Second World War, the legitimation of anti-Semitism and the legitimation of turning against Jews and blaming Jews. We're seeing for the first time in recent American history at least, members of Congress making anti-Semitic statements and not being condemned for it by the leaders of the Democratic Party. So we're in a difficult time, and we have to fight back. And I'm glad to have an opportunity to express these views to the Mizrahi audience.
Well, Alan, you just mentioned members of Congress, and of course, there's kind of a game out there where people think that you can say virtually anything, and you should be allowed to say anything under the limits of free speech. How does the whole concept that you are one of the people who defended the Nazis' right to march in Skokie, which was probably one of the greatest acts of anti-Semitism, displays of anti-Semitism, and yet you defended their rights because it was free speech. How do you make a dichotomy between the right to have freedom of speech and to have to say when it's free speech, when it's bad speech, and what is speech which is not permissible?
Well, I think that all speech should be permissible, including anti-Semitism. We shouldn't restrict free speech. We shouldn't give the government the power to tell us what we can say. But free speech also gives us the right to condemn those that criticize free speech in the way the Nazis did, in the way the hard left does against Israel today. So I'm not afraid of the marketplace of ideas. Let the debates go on. I don't want the help of the government in suppressing anti-Semitic speech. I just want the marketplace of ideas to remain open. What we're happening today, though, is selective application of free speech. There is free speech to condemn Jews and to be anti-Semitic. There is no free speech today to condemn other groups. If you make an anti-Palestinian statement on a college campus today, you're canceled and you're condemned. If you make an anti-Israel or anti-Semitic statement, you're not condemned. And of course, the anti-Semites have figured out a new language where they disguise their anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism, but all you have to do is scratch the surface. And you see that it really is motivated by a hatred of Jews. And one of the biggest problems is that among the most vocal anti-Semites in the world today are Jews. Jews on the hard left, Jews among feminists, Jews among gays, Jews among many other good causes, Jews among intersectionalists, Jews among environmentalists. They single out the nation state of the Jewish people for a special condemnation, and they single out Jewish supporters of Israel. I have been canceled on college campuses today because of my support for Israel. There are efforts to try to deplatform me and prevent me from speaking. They tried to do it at Berkeley. I threatened a federal lawsuit, and they ultimately capitulated, and I got a large crowd. But I'm not being invited today to speak on many college campuses because of my support for Israel, because it's feared that if it's announced that a supporter of Israel will be speaking, there will be protests. I was invited to speak at Harvard, where I taught for 50 years, by Chabad. And Chabad called me and said, we have to move your speech off campus because we're afraid if you speak in behalf of Israel on the campus, there will be efforts to silence you and they may turn violent. So we have to move the speech a few blocks away off campus, and it was moved off campus. It had a very large crowd, and it was fine. But there is a double standard. So I don't want censorship. I just want a single standard. I want what I call the Circle of Civility. That is, whatever the rules are on universities for what is permitted and what is forbidden has to be symmetrical. It has to apply to every group equally. There can't be special rules for Jews, special rules for blacks, special rules for Palestinians, special rules for any other group. There has to be identical rules involving free speech. My preference is complete free speech for everybody. If the Nazis had been allowed to just march through Skokie, nobody would have noticed. They would have lost the fight. The reason they won the day is because there were efforts to censor them. Censorship turns villains into heroes. There are efforts now in Canada to create new laws to ban hate speech and speech that vilifies particular groups. That will be turned against Israel, and it will be turned against Jews. The first group to be deplatformed will be Zionists. And so even from a self-interested point of view, as a Zionist, as a supporter of Israel, as a proud Jew, even from a very self-interested point of view, I think free speech is the preferable answer to the problem, and hate speech laws will always be applied selectively and will, in this atmosphere, be applied selectively against Jewish and Zionist values and speakers.
Alan, one thing which we've seen over the recent period is, of course, especially after the recent engagement in Gaza, is that it seems to fuel the fire of anti-Semitism, and do you see a peak coming up in this? And is this something which is going to be returning to us each time Israel has to rise up and defend itself?
Yes, of course. Hamas has figured it out. They're smart. They know that every few years they send rockets and try to target Israeli children and civilians. Israel will have to respond, and they know that that will provide the newest excuse for anti-Semitism. But it's an excuse. Look, if a couple of hundred people are killed in Gaza, many of them terrorists, others targets, that is, others used as human shields. Whenever that happens, the world goes crazy. But when 4,000 Palestinians are killed in Syria, not a peep. When tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed in Jordan in Black September, not a peep. The world doesn't care about Palestinians. It's not that Palestinians are being victimized. It's that the Jews, Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, are the alleged victimizers. How can you ignore 4,000 Palestinians being killed in Syria and focus on a couple of hundred being killed in Gaza without being accused of anti-Semitism, of having a double standard? So, yeah, Hamas will again attack Israel. They will again win the propaganda war because it will provide the latest excuse for anti-Semitism. And unless and until the world singularly condemns Hamas for double war crimes, for using children as human shields, and for targeting children in Israel, this process will continue and more Palestinians will die, more Jews will die, more condemnations will occur against Israel, more anti-Semitism will exist. And it's so obvious. Anybody should be able to see through this, but the New York Times doesn't see through it. The Boston Globe doesn't see through it. The hard left doesn't see through it. Well, they do see through it. They just pretend not to. The squad in Congress doesn't see through it. Many students who are young and don't remember the past think this is the first time this has happened. So they don't see through it. And you get all these petitions against Israel that are designed by hard left bigots and signed by useful idiots. Useful idiots will sign anything you put in front of them, which is written by the hard left and which condemns Israel. I think it was Abi Ibn many, many years ago who said that if the United Nations, if Algeria introduced a resolution that the world is flat and that Israel flattened it, it would win 126 to 37 with 42 abstentions. You can count the votes in advance, you know. The same thing is true on college campuses. No matter what you put in a petition, you will get a majority of students at Yale and at Princeton and at Berkeley signing it. It could say anything. As long as it's anti-Israel, it will be signed. It can have the most blatant ignorance, historical inaccuracies, but it will be signed if it's anti-Israel and allegedly pro-Palestinian. But let me emphasize, other than Palestinians and other than people who have themselves experienced the occupation, etc., I have never really met a pro-Palestinian. I have met many anti-Israelis, but I don't recall ever meeting anybody who complained about the Syrians killing Palestinians or the Jordanians killing Palestinians, or Hamas killing Palestinians, or the Palestinian Authority. You get a complaint against the Palestinian Authority killing Palestinians, but it comes from Palestinian human rights activists like Professor Ide and others, but you don't get it from the hard left in America. Where is the complaint about what happened to the Palestinian dissident who died in prison and was found with blood in his lungs? You hear it from some Palestinian activists, and you hear it from Israelis who are concerned about Palestinians, but you don't hear it from the same college students that condemn Israel every time a Palestinian terrorist is killed or every time a human shield used by the Palestinians is killed. So it's just plain ordinary bigotry. And let's not pretend it's anything else. So let's understand that the most of the manifestations of delegitimation, the 4 Ds that Sharansky puts out, are manifestations of anti-Semitism, nothing else. That it's the old historical hatred of the Jews in a new guise, but it's very much the same as it has been throughout history.
Well, Alan, I'd like to do something which is kind of like a lightning round with you, if you will. We talked about anti-Semitism, and we talked about it in the realm of hatred of Jews worldwide, and especially focused a lot on Israel. Can you walk us through country by country or region by region how anti-Semitism may differ from one place to another? Start with Europe.
Well, sure. Look, Europe has always had a history of anti-Semitism. Herzl was brilliantly correct when he pointed out at the end of the 19th century that there was no future for Jews in any part of Europe. He was writing about Vienna and France, but he could have been writing about the Ukraine and Russia. And, you know, people forget that the countries that get off the hook were really villainous. Holland was one of the most villainous countries during the Holocaust. It turned in Jews. It didn't do anything to protect them. There were individuals who did great things. There were individuals in Poland, individuals in the Ukraine. But Holland performed horribly. Norway performed horribly. Why should we expect that the grandchildren of people who turned in Jews during the Holocaust should be any different? Ireland behaved horribly. It supported the Nazis during the Second World War. There was a large Nazi movement in England. Remember England's history of anti-Semitism. It expelled the Jews. It tried to pass a law in the middle of the 18th century giving Jews the right to vote or to be in parliament without converting, and that was immediately rescinded. So anti-Semitism in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, has been part of its history. So why be surprised that it came back and it resurfaced years later in the guise of anti-Zionism?
Can you talk a little bit? Is it much different in South America? You've also, I remember a couple of years ago, you were in Australia, and how does it differ, if you will, from place to place?
It differs considerably. In South America, it was historically anti-Semitism. A lot of it was church-based anti-Semitism, particularly through the Catholic Church. That has changed with the changes within the Catholic Church. And now anti-Semitism in South America is largely a function of the hard left, but it's there, and one sees it in Brazil, one sees it in Chile, one sees it in many countries. I had a call just the other day from a prominent Jew about what's going on in Chile now, and there are some very, very bad manifestations of anti-Semitism going on there. I saw much less anti-Semitism in Australia. Mostly, again, it came from the hard left, but it's less apparent there and in Canada than in other parts of the world. Interestingly enough, there's less of it today in Northern Africa than there has been in the past. A recent visit I made to Morocco, I was very pleased with the amount of philo-Semitism that I saw among some of the Moroccan leaders. So it does vary all over the world. It's different in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. It's different in Poland and the Ukraine and Russia than it is in other countries. In those countries, it's the hard right that is more anti-Semitic. But today, you find alliances between Jews and some people on the hard right. It's very complex. Anti-Semitism has strange bedfellows, and philo-Semitism has strange bedfellows. And so don't blame Jews for making alliances with people we don't like. If you're drowning in the sea and somebody throws you a life raft, you don't ask whether or not the person is conservative or liberal. You grab the life raft, and then maybe you try to persuade them that their views are incorrect.
Alan, the whole world is just starting to emerge from a terrible plague. The world has known plagues before, and plagues throughout the centuries have been a trigger, as virtually any bad thing which happens to everyone all over the world, as perhaps to scapegoat the Jews for anti-Semitism. Do you have any thoughts about the relationship between COVID-19 and what we've seen following this and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I've been actually pleasantly surprised. I've seen less of it than I anticipated from the plague. Part of it is because Jews have played such a major role in curing or preventing or vaccinating. So many Jews have played prominent roles, from my friend Len Schleifer, who created a drug that was used to save the life of President Trump, to the head of Pfizer, who is Jewish, and to Israel. And Israel has done so much. It's very hard. I mean, if you're an anti-Semite and you have COVID and you refuse to use any of the medicine or any of the procedures that have been developed by Jews, you're going to die. And so I think this plague, less than others, has generated anti-Semitism. I think part of the reason is because the new anti-Semitism is primarily a feature of the hard left, not the hard right. The hard right still has plenty of it, and it would be the hard right that would be taking advantage of the plague, and the hard left wouldn't find that an opportunity to do, and so that may explain part of it. But I think also the fact that so many Jews and so many Israelis have done so much good, and that Israel has been really a light unto the world in the way it's dealt with COVID, although obviously problems continue to exist there with the new variants. But Israel has been a leader in the fight against any kind of medical illness. And so Israelis ought to be very proud of their contribution. Look, no country in the history of humankind has ever contributed more to humankind in 70 plus years of its existence than Israel has. No country in history has contributed more medically, scientifically, technologically, agriculturally, philosophically, from literature and music, from the use of military tactics designed to minimize civilian casualties and human rights. Israel has been a light unto the world for the 70-some years that it's been in existence, and the world should recognize that. Mostly it doesn't. Mostly the hard left doesn't. The hard left can see nothing positive in Israel. The definition of anti-Semitism that came out of Poland in the 1920s and 30s is that if anything bad occurs, it must be the responsibility of the Jews. And if anything good occurs, Jews can't have anything to have done with it. And I think that's what the hard left is saying today. They don't credit the Jews for what they've done to combat COVID, but they blame the Jews for all the evils of the world. There was a woman, I think her name was Claire Short, she was a parliamentarian in England, who actually blamed the environment on Jews and said that the world will come to an end as the result of Jews in Israel. People just go crazy. I mean, the Jew or Israel derangement syndrome should be part of diagnosis. When people hear about Israel, people hear about Jews, their thought processes change. Noam Chomsky is a very smart guy when it comes to linguistics. When it comes to Israel, he's a damn fool. He's really just stupid. He doesn't understand history. He doesn't understand logic. I mean, his IQ goes from 150 to 80 when he switches from linguistics to Israel. By the way, the same thing was true with Albert Einstein, although Albert Einstein was a great Zionist. When you read his writings on politics, they're drivel for the most part. So don't ever, we all know not to take seriously what actors say about Israel or what entertainers say about Israel. We hopefully we know that. But we should also understand that we shouldn't take seriously what linguists or scientists or chemists or physicists say about Israel. There are multiple types of intelligence, and people who can be brilliant in one area can really, really be stupid in another area. And I think Noam Chomsky is a perfect example of that.
Well, Alan, as we're winding down, what I'd like to kind of ask you, you've made, I remember you have a classic line about what's the difference between an optimist and a Jewish optimist and a Jewish pessimist. But I'd like you to know, I'd like to first you maybe talk about that. And then if you can, what do you see as a reason for optimism, again, as Tisha B'Av winds down and we leave that period of really somber thoughts? What gives you hope, especially in the world of combating anti-Semitism? Well,
a lot. I borrowed from an Israeli comedian my statement where he says, in Israel, a pessimist says, oy vey, things are so bad they can't possibly get worse. And the optimist says, yes, they can. I think things can get worse. I do think things can get worse. I don't think we'll ever see a repetition of what happened in the 1930s and 1940s, but things can get much worse. But I think things are going to get better. And I think part of the reason for it is a knife that cuts both ways, and that is modern technology. Modern technology is a megaphone for anti-Semitism. Obviously, the internet is a megaphone for anti-Semitism. But modern technology also favors Israel and Jewish ingenuity and scientific and technological advancements. And I think the world will be a different place. I was born almost 83 years ago. When I was born, one could not have imagined the changes in the world. When I was born, America, the United States, was systemically, not only systemically racist, it was systemically anti-Semitic. Systemically anti-Semitic. You couldn't get into colleges, medical schools, you couldn't live in neighborhoods. There was systemic anti-Semitism. I was first in my class at Yale Law School, editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, potential Supreme Court law clerk and Harvard professor, and I was turned down by 32 out of 32 Wall Street firms. That was systemic anti-Semitism. That's changed. Today we don't have either systemic anti-Semitism or systemic racism. In fact, we have systemic anti-racism. And I think we also have systemic anti-Semitism, but in both instances. We have too many pockets of racism among people and too many pockets of anti-Semitism. But I think the fact that the systemic nature of anti-Semitism has changed in the 83 years of my life is a positive sign. And I think we have to continue to be proud of the accomplishments of the Jewish people and of Israel. We have to continue to fight anti-Semitism. Never, never let an anti-Semite get away with anything. We're trying to start a new organization. There's been so many attacks on Jews. We're trying to start an organization of lawyers, roughly called Hit a Jew, We Sue You, in which any person who hits or assaults or attacks a Jew physically, not talking about now free speech, any person who attacks a Jew physically, if we can get their name, if we can identify them, we don't care how poor they are or how rich they are, we will sue them. We will take away every single penny they have. We will take away their car. We will take away their apartment. We will take away everything they have. We will make them pay a price for anti-Semitic attacks. We must make it clear that nobody can get away with attacking a Jew. I don't want to see us return to the days of the Jewish Defense League. I don't believe in ayin tachat ayin. I believe in mishpat, in tzedek, tzedek derdof. If you engage in injustice against us, we will engage in justice against you. We will use the law to combat violent anti-Semitism. So we have to continue to fight back. We have to continue to use the law, to use our technology, to use our ability to express ideas, to write books, to write op-eds, to fight against anti-Semitism in the marketplace of ideas. And I commend Mizrahi for being a very, very important part of that fight. My mother was a lifelong member of Mizrahi. I remember we would have Mizrahi meetings in my house. I never understood why it was called Mizrahi. I mean, everybody was an Ashkenazi who belonged to it, but we loved the term Mizrahi. And the organization Mizrahi has been a phenomenal organization. It's been part of Israel's history, and I'm proud to contribute to Mizrahi by having this dialogue with my friend Danny today.
Well, Alan, before we close, I just want to ask you one thing. You mentioned that your next birthday, which is about 6 weeks away, and and you mentioned a new initiative which you're taking part of. I like to tell people that Alan Dershowitz has the energy of 8 10-year-olds. So what can we expect next for you to be writing about? What have you? I know we talked a little bit about freedom of speech and how that is in the world today. You've just written about that. Can you talk about that? And what about other books that you have in the works?
Well, I just finished my 8th book in 2 years. And my 8th book is entitled The Case for Colorblind Equality in the Age of Identity Politics, a call for a return to Martin Luther King's dream of a day when his children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So that's my next book. The book after that I'm thinking about writing is called The Price of Principle, and how difficult it is to live a principled life today in the age of extremism on both sides. And it's largely autobiographical about how I've been attacked both by the right and the left for trying to be a principled neutral, for defending the right of Donald Trump, for example, not to be impeached, while not defending his policies and voting against him and voting for Joe Biden. Trying to live a life of principle, a life of neutral principle, a life based on tzedek, a life based on the ability to see both sides is becoming more and more difficult. So thinking about writing my next book on the price of principle, the cost of trying to live a life that isn't partisan and doesn't choose sides. But, I'm getting older, and I hope that the good Lord will give me the strength to continue, perhaps not until 120, but, maybe a few more years. I've just written my 48th book. So my short-term goal is to get to 50. And my longer-term goal is to see Israel and the Jewish people normalized. Herzl thought that by establishing a nation state for the Jewish people, it will ultimately normalize the Jewish people in the world. He was wrong about very, very few things, but tragically, let me put it this way, he hasn't yet been proved right about the normalization. I hope I'll live to see a time when Herzl's dream of a normalized Jewish people where Jews can simply contribute to the world and be a light unto the world without being falsely attacked will become a reality.
Well, Alan, let me just close with Rabbi Kook's very, very famous words, is that just as the Second Temple was destroyed because of gratuitous hate, that the next Third Temple will be rebuilt on the basis of gratuitous love among Jews. So do you have any final words you'd like to say to all your Jewish brethren out there?
If we're counting
as well as non-Jews
if we're counting on Jews getting together and not arguing, we're not going to have a Third Temple. If we can at least agree to disagree civilly and to stop ad hominems and to stop fighting with each other needlessly, even while disagreeing, we're always going to be two Jews, three opinions, two Israelis, 11 political parties. We're always going to have that. But if we can at least agree to be civil and I just want to use this opportunity to express both my appreciation to President Rivlin, who I think did a phenomenal job as the president of Israel, and to the incoming president, my friend, Isaac Herzog. I think we'll do a great job in uniting Jews together. I see the role of the president of Israel as the uniter of Jews around the world. And so I want to wish a hearty mazel tov to the new president of Israel and a hearty mazel tov to the outgoing president of Israel, who did a phenomenal job. As you know, I don't like to get involved in partisan Israeli politics. I am pro-Israel. Whoever the prime minister of Israel is, I support the prime minister of Israel. But I do feel that I can always comment on the presidency of Israel, because that's a nonpartisan position. And so I'm so thrilled about who the new president is and who he's replacing. So may you go from strength to strength.
Well, thank you, Alan. And of course, your famous words are always reasonable people can disagree about anything as long as we keep it within the realm of a machloket, of a disagreement, l'shem shamayim. Then it will be sofo l'tkayim, that we will be able to, bring about, hopefully, resolution to even our greatest conflicts. So I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us here. And
we have to remember that the first book ever to respect and commend dissenters was the Talmud, at a time when other religions were burning and crucifying and murdering dissidents. The Talmud was honoring, and the Mishnah were honoring dissidents, giving them places of honor and recognizing the room for disagreement and dissent, and understanding that not every debate can end with a resolution. My favorite word in the Talmud and the Mishnah has always been teku. Both sides have points of view. So let's continue to live in the Talmudic tradition, in which we argue with each other, in which we help educate each other, but we do it with civility and with dignity and with honor.
Alan, I can't thank you enough for all your words of wisdom, and I'm sure that everybody here has gained something from you today. And just the last words, of course, an easy fast to everyone out there. And hopefully we'll have good news and other topics to talk about in the near future.
Thank you.
Adonai b'chio b'tzion